January 1767. Samuel Pringle crouched inside a hollow sycamore while wolves scratched at the bark. One charge of powder remained. One shot. 7 wolves circled in the darkness, their yellow eyes reflecting the dying firelight. 200 miles from the nearest settlement, his brother had been gone for 3 months, maybe frozen dead in a snowbank somewhere in the Alleghenies. The temperature had dropped so low that living trees cracked like gunshots in the night. Every fur trader who worked this country said the same thing. No man survives an Allegheny winter without a cabin. But Samuel Pringle was still breathing. This is the story of 2 deserters who proved the experts wrong by living inside a rotting tree. The Buckhannon River Valley lay buried under 3 feet of snow, and Samuel Pringle sat alone inside a dying tree, listening to wolves. The hollow sycamore rose 40 feet above the frozen riverbank, its mottled white bark ghostly against the gray afternoon sky. Inside the 11-foot deep cavity, Samuel fed another stick to the small fire burning in the pit he had carved into the rotted heartwood. Smoke curled upward through the natural chimney of the trunk, mixing with the scent of cured venison hanging in the upper reaches of the hollow. His breath formed clouds that drifted toward the narrow opening above. 2 charges of powder remained, 2 shots between him and starvation. His brother John had been gone for 3 months, maybe 4. Samuel had lost count somewhere around Christmas, when the snow started falling and did not stop. John had walked east toward the settlements on the south branch of the Potomac, 200 miles through mountain wilderness to buy ammunition and supplies. If he made it. If the British Army did not arrest him. If he did not freeze to death crossing the Alleghenies in winter. Outside, the wolves circled. Samuel could hear their paws crunching through the crusted snow, could see their shapes moving between the bare trees along Turkey Run. They smelled the meat. They knew he was inside. 200 miles east, settlers with cabins and livestock and communities were dying that winter. Families with stored grain and neighbors to help were freezing in their beds. Samuel Pringle had none of those things. He had a rotting tree, 2 bullets, and no way to know if his brother was alive. But he was still breathing. 6 years earlier, these 2 men had been soldiers at Fort Pitt, and the British Army wanted them dead. The spring of 1761 found John and Samuel Pringle inside one of the largest military fortifications in North America, and they were learning that a uniform was just another kind of prison. Fort Pitt squatted at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, like a great stone fist, its pentagonal walls enclosing nearly 2 acres of parade grounds, barracks, and misery. The brothers had enlisted in the colonial militia to fight the French. What they found instead was dysentery, rotten rations, and officers who treated enlisted men like livestock. The population of the fort had more than doubled in a year, swelling from 149 souls to over 300, and the barracks could not hold them all. Men slept in shifts. The latrines overflowed. The flux swept through the garrison in waves, killing more soldiers than French musket balls ever had. Samuel was 33 years old that spring. His half-brother John was older, somewhere between 34 and 44. Even he seemed uncertain of his exact birth year. They had come from Philadelphia, immigrated from England, and made their way to the south branch of the Potomac before enlisting. They had expected to fight. They had not expected to die of diarrhea in a cramped wooden barracks while officers dined on fresh meat in the commandant's quarters. In June, a sergeant's wife was dragged from the settlement outside the walls and publicly whipped. Her crime: hiding deserters. The punishment told the Pringle brothers 2 things. First, that desertion was common enough to require severe deterrence. Second, that men who ran were hunted, and those who helped them were destroyed. They started planning anyway. The decision crystallized on a night when Samuel watched a 19-year-old private from Lancaster die of the bloody flux, shaking and crying for his mother, while the surgeon shrugged and moved on to the next cot. The boy had been healthy 2 weeks earlier. Now his body would be dumped in an unmarked grave outside the walls, and his family would never know what happened to him. Samuel found John behind the powder magazine that night. "We cannot stay," Samuel said. John nodded. He had already spoken with 2 other men, William Childers and Joseph Lindsay, who felt the same. 4 soldiers. 1 chance. If they were caught, they would hang. West, John said. Up the Monongahela, into territory no patrol will follow. West meant wilderness. West meant land claimed by hostile nations, unmarked on any map, forbidden to settlers by treaties the brothers had never read. West meant abandoning everything, rank, pay, the possibility of ever returning to the settlements, the women they knew, the families they might have started. West meant survival. They left on a moonless night in the summer of 1761, 4 men slipping past sentries who were half asleep and wholly indifferent. They carried their rifles, their powder horns, their shot pouches, and nothing else. No food, no tools, no money, nothing that could not be explained away if they were stopped. No one stopped them. They ascended the Monongahela for 3 days, then cut east to the Youghiogheny, then climbed into the high mountain meadows the locals called the Glades. The air was thin and cold, even in summer. The forest seemed to swallow them whole. For the first time since enlisting, Samuel Pringle felt like he could breathe. They camped in those glades for nearly a year, hunting deer and turkey, learning the rhythms of the mountain wilderness. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like waiting. They needed supplies. Powder and lead were running low. A man could live on meat alone, but he could not kill meat without ammunition. Samuel found the path on a hunting trip in the early spring of 1762. It wound down from the glades toward the east, worn smooth by years of use. Indian trail, probably, or maybe traders. He followed it for 2 days, moving carefully, until he saw wood smoke rising above the trees. Looney's Creek, the westernmost European settlement on the South Branch. Civilization, of a sort. Samuel returned to the glades with news that supplies were less than a week's travel away. The 4 deserters gathered what furs they had accumulated and walked toward Looney's Creek, telling themselves they would be careful. They would trade quickly, speak little, avoid anyone who might recognize them. They were not careful enough. Childers was spotted first. A man from the settlements knew his face, knew he had been stationed at Fort Pitt, knew he had disappeared. The word went out before Childers could even finish his transaction. Within an hour, both Childers and Lindsay were in chains. John grabbed Samuel's arm and hauled him into the trees. They ran. Behind them, they could hear Childers shouting, then the sound of a blow, then silence. They did not stop. They did not look back. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, and then they kept running. 3 days later, the Pringle brothers crouched in a hollow beneath a rock overhang, 50 miles from Looney's Creek, gasping for air and trying to understand what had just happened. Their companions were gone, captured, imprisoned probably, executed possibly. The settlements were closed to them now. Any European they encountered was a potential informant, a potential bounty hunter, a potential hangman. They were alone. They were hunted. And they were running out of ammunition. Samuel's hands were still shaking. What do we do? John stared at the forest floor for a long moment. When he looked up, his face was set like stone. We find someone who can teach us to survive out here, someone who knows this territory, and then we disappear so deep into the wilderness that no one will ever find us. His name was John Simpson, and he was the most capable man the Pringle brothers had ever met. Simpson was a fur trader who worked the Trans-Allegheny region, moving between Indian villages and white settlements with equal ease. He knew which streams held beaver, which ridges the deer crossed, which valleys flooded in spring. He had survived alone in territory that killed other men, and he did it year after year while turning a profit. The Pringles found him, or he found them, somewhere in the mountains west of the South Branch, in the summer of 1762. Simpson listened to their story with the flat expression of a man who had heard similar tales before. "Deserters," he said. It was not a question. "Men who want to stay alive," John replied. Simpson studied them for a long moment. Then he shrugged. "I can use help running trap lines. You work for me through the season. I'll teach you what I know." They worked. They learned. Simpson showed them how to read game trails, how to preserve meat, how to build fires that gave warmth without smoke, how to move through the forest without leaving signs. He was a hard teacher and a harder taskmaster. But by the time the leaves turned, the Pringle brothers understood the wilderness in ways they never had before. And then Samuel made the mistake of telling Simpson their plan. "West," Samuel said, "deep into the territory beyond the mountains. We'll find a place so remote that no patrol, no trader, no settler will ever stumble across us. We'll disappear." Simpson set down the beaver pelt he was scraping. His expression shifted from neutral to something that looked almost like pity. "You'll die. We've survived this long. You've survived a summer. A summer is nothing." Simpson stood, wiping his hands on his leather apron. "Listen to me. I've been working this territory for 15 years. I've seen what it does to men who think they can live alone out there. You cannot survive an Allegheny winter without a cabin. You cannot survive without a community to help when you're sick or injured. You cannot survive without a supply line for powder, lead, tools, cloth. The two of you alone in unmapped wilderness?" He shook his head. "You'll be dead before January." "We can build a cabin," John said. "A cabin takes 3 men working 60 days. You have 2 men, and winter is 3 months away. Even if you finish it, a cabin is a flag that says, 'People live here.' Every hunter, every trapper, every Indian war party that crosses through will see it. You'll be found within a year." Simpson picked up the pelt again, his voice flat with finality. "I'm sorry. I like you boys. But what you're describing is suicide." Samuel felt his face flush. "Then what would you have us do? Turn ourselves in? Hang for desertion?" "I'd have you winter with me, work another season, build up supplies. Then maybe find a place on the edge of the settlements where you can blend in, where enough time has passed that no one remembers your faces. The settlements are death for us. Childers and Lindsay. We're recognized by bad luck. You stay careful, you stay quiet, you might make it." Simpson turned away, done with the conversation. "But going west alone, into territory no white man has mapped, with nothing but your rifles and a prayer? That's not freedom. That's a slow way to die." The brothers left Simpson at a bend in the Cheat River the following spring. John called it the horseshoe, for the way the water curved back on itself. Simpson called it foolishness. "I've told you what will happen," Simpson said. "You're choosing to ignore me." "We're choosing to live on our own terms," John replied. Simpson shook his head one last time. Then he turned his canoe downstream and paddled away without looking back. The Pringle brothers watched until he disappeared around the bend. They were alone again, 2 men against the entire Allegheny wilderness. Behind them, the British military machine still turned, still kept records, still hunted deserters. Ahead, 200 miles of unmapped forest waited, full of wolves and bears and mountain lions, and the constant grinding threat of starvation. Above them, the pale sky of early spring stretched endlessly, indifferent to whether they lived or died. John shouldered his pack. "Let's go." They walked west. October 7th, 1763, King George III put his signature on a document that changed everything the Pringle brothers thought they knew. They did not learn about it for years. By the time word reached them, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 had already reshaped the map of North America. All territory west of the Allegheny Mountains was now designated the Indian Reserve. Settlement was forbidden. Land grants were voided. Any European found living west of the proclamation line was, by definition, a criminal. The Pringle brothers had been criminals since the night they left Fort Pitt. Now they were criminals twice over, deserters and illegal occupants of Crown-protected Indian land. If they were caught, they would face courts-martial and civilian charges both. The hangman's rope had doubled. They did not know this. They only knew that the wilderness was getting harder. By the summer of 1764, they had traveled up the Tygart Valley River, following tributaries deeper and deeper into the mountains. The country was rich with game. Elk and bison still roamed the high meadows. Deer were thick in the hollows. Wild turkeys clustered along the streams. But game required ammunition, and ammunition was running out. Every shot now carried weight. Miss a deer, go hungry. wound a bear, face a fight they might not survive. The mathematics of survival had narrowed to a brutal equation: make every bullet count or die. John stopped at a fork in the river where a smaller stream entered from the right. "This one," he said. Samuel looked up the narrow valley. The stream, they would later call it Turkey Run, for the flocks of wild birds that fed along its banks, wound between steep hillsides thick with ancient trees. Sycamores grew along the water, their white bark luminous in the afternoon light. "Why? Feel that?" John held up his hand. The air was different here, warmer somehow, despite the shade. The valley walls blocked the wind that had cut through them all day. They followed Turkey Run upstream, moving slowly, watching for sign of other humans. They saw none. No trails, no fire rings, no cut stumps or blazed trees. This valley, at least, was empty. The storm came on fast, the way mountain storms do. One moment the sky was hazy with summer humidity. The next, black clouds rolled over the ridge and lightning split the air. Rain fell in sheets so thick Samuel could not see his brother 10 feet ahead. John shouted something. Samuel could not hear over the thunder. Then John was pulling him toward one of the massive sycamores, toward a dark opening at its base. They tumbled through the gap and found themselves inside the tree. The hollow was enormous. Samuel stood up, and his head did not touch the ceiling. He stretched out his arms, and his fingertips did not reach the walls. The space was perhaps 8 feet across, maybe more, large enough to turn a fence rail inside, he thought, though he did not know why that measurement occurred to him. The walls were thick with the spongy rot of ancient heartwood, but above them the living tree still grew, its bark intact, its canopy still drinking sunlight far overhead. The rain hammered outside. Inside, they were dry. Samuel looked at John. John looked at Samuel. "A shelter," Samuel said slowly. "A cabin would take 2 months." "This is already built." John ran his hand along the interior wall. The wood was soft, decayed, but the living bark that surrounded it was solid. American sycamores did this, he knew. They grew so fast, so large, that their heartwood could not keep up. The center rotted while the tree lived on, creating cavities that bears used for dens and owls used for nests, and that men might use for shelter. Simpson said we could not survive without a cabin. John's voice was thoughtful, not dismissive. He did not say anything about a tree. Samuel shook his head. "A tree cannot keep us warm through January. We need walls. We need a roof. We need a door we can bar against wolves." "Look at these walls." John slapped the interior. 3 feet thick, at least. A cabin's walls are, 6 inches of logs and daubing? This is warmer than any cabin. And if it catches fire? Sycamore is green wood, wet. It does not burn easily. John was pacing now, his mind working. "We build a fire pit here, at the base. The heat rises. The smoke goes up through the hollow. See how it narrows above us? Natural chimney. The cavity stays warm. We stay alive. And if someone sees the smoke? Who will see it? We have walked for 2 years and seen no one. This valley is empty. This stream is not on any map." John turned to face his brother, his eyes bright despite the gloom. "Samuel, a cabin tells the world where we are. A tree is invisible. From the outside, this is just another sycamore. From the inside, it is everything we need." Samuel wanted to argue. He wanted to list all the reasons this could not work: the dampness, the smoke, the predators, the simple fact that no one lived inside trees. Human beings built structures. Human beings conquered nature. They did not hide inside it like frightened animals. But the rain was still falling outside, and they were dry. The wind was still howling through the valley, and they were warm. The tree had already done what Simpson said was impossible. "1 winter," Samuel said finally. "We try it for 1 winter. If we survive, we stay. If we do not, we will be beyond caring." They shook on it, there in the hollow of the dying sycamore, while thunder rolled across the mountains and the world outside dissolved into gray. The first test of their decision came 3 weeks later, in the form of voices on the river. Samuel was checking fishing lines along the Buckhannon when he heard them. Men's voices carrying across the water in the early morning stillness. Two of them, maybe three, speaking English with the easy rhythm of experienced travelers. He dropped to his belly in the underbrush and did not move. The voices grew louder. Through the leaves, Samuel could see a canoe rounding the bend upstream. Two men paddled while a third sat in the middle, a rifle across his knees. Fur traders, probably. Simpson's people, or men like him, working the streams for beaver and mink. Samuel's heart pounded so hard he was certain they could hear it. The men were close enough now that he could see their faces. Bearded, weather-worn, alert, scanning the banks for sign of game or sign of men. If they spotted him, everything was over. They would remember two strangers in a valley that should be empty. They would mention it at the next trading post. Word would spread, questions would be asked, and eventually someone would come looking. The canoe glided past, not 20 feet from where Samuel lay pressed against the earth. One of the paddlers paused, cocking his head. Heard something. Deer, probably. This valley's thick with them. They moved on. The voices faded. Samuel did not move for another hour. That night, he told John what had happened. They sat in the darkness of the hollow, the fire banked to embers to minimize smoke. We were lucky, Samuel said. If I had been standing, you were not standing. You were careful. Next time I might not be. John was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. There cannot be a next time. From now on, we hunt only at dawn and dusk. We keep no fire during the day. We leave no trails, no camps, no sign of habitation. If anyone comes near this valley, we disappear into the tree, and we do not come out until they are gone. And if they find us anyway? John did not answer. He did not need to. They both knew what capture meant. The summer passed in a haze of preparation. They cleared the rotted wood from the interior of the Sycamore, hauling out armfuls of punk and decay until the cavity was clean enough to inhabit. They dug a fire pit at the base, lining it with river stones that would hold heat through the night. They created shelves in the upper reaches of the hollow where meat could be smoked and stored. Every day Samuel listened for voices on the river. Every night he dreamed of soldiers surrounding the tree, torches in their hands. The fear never went away. It just became background noise, like the wind in the branches or the howling of wolves in the distance. They lived with it the way they lived with hunger, with cold, with the constant ache of muscles pushed beyond endurance. It was simply part of survival. Fall arrived, and the pace of work intensified. Game had to be taken, processed, preserved. They shot deer and elk when they could afford the ammunition. They trapped rabbits with snares made from their own shoestrings. They fished the river until their hands cracked and bled from the cold water. Every piece of meat that hung in the hollow was another day they would not starve. Samuel kept count in his head. One deer, smoked and dried, might feed 2 men for 2 weeks. A bison, and they had seen bison in the upland meadows, could last a month or more. But bison required close shots, and close shots meant using precious powder on an animal that might charge instead of fall. "We're still short," he told John one evening in late October. The hollow was cramped now, with strips of venison hanging from every available surface. The air smelled of wood smoke and salt and the faint musk of cured meat. How short? Samuel did the calculation again, hoping the numbers would change. They did not. If the winter is mild, we might make it. If it is hard, it will not be mild. The valleys have already had frost. Then we will be hungry before February. John stared at the fire. His face was thinner than it had been in the spring, his cheekbones sharp beneath weathered skin. They had both lost weight. The constant labor of hunting, hauling, processing, it burned more than they could replace. "We do what we can," John said. "The tree will keep us warm. Warmth means less food needed. If we have to, we eat bark and roots. Men have survived on worse." Samuel did not argue. There was nothing to argue about. The numbers were the numbers. They would either make it or they would not. The first snow fell in November. It started as a light dusting, almost gentle, the flakes drifting down through the bare branches like ash from a distant fire. By morning, 6 inches covered the ground. By the following week, the drifts reached Samuel's knees. Inside the sycamore, the brothers settled into the rhythm that would define their existence for the next 3 winters. Wake before dawn, bank the fire low to conserve wood, eat a small portion of dried meat, never as much as they wanted, always less than their bodies craved. Hunt if the weather allowed, and the ammunition could be spared. Otherwise, stay inside the hollow, conserving energy, conserving heat, conserving everything. The tree performed exactly as John had predicted. Its walls, 3 feet thick in places, insulated them against the bitter cold that swept down from the mountains. The fire pit threw heat upward into the cavity, warming the air that surrounded them. The smoke rose through the natural chimney of the hollow trunk, dispersing into the canopy far above, where it dissipated into the gray winter sky. On the coldest nights, when the temperature plunged far below zero and the river ice groaned and cracked like a living thing, Samuel pressed his back against the interior wall and felt warmth seeping through from the banked coals. The wood itself had become a heat sink, storing the energy of the fire and releasing it slowly through the long hours of darkness. He thought about Simpson's words. You cannot survive an Allegheny winter without a cabin. Simpson had been wrong, or rather, Simpson had not been able to imagine a cabin that nature had already built. But the cold was only one enemy. The other was hunger. By January, their food stores were half depleted. By February, they were eating portions so small that Samuel's stomach ached constantly, a hollow gnawing that never quite went away. They supplemented with bark stripped from elm trees, boiled until it became a bitter mush that provided bulk, if not nourishment. They set snares in the snow and caught rabbits when they were lucky, nothing when they were not. Samuel grew dizzy standing up. His hands shook when he tried to hold his rifle steady. He could count his ribs through the worn fabric of his shirt. And the wolves grew bolder. They had always been there, circling the edges of the valley, drawn by the scent of stored meat. But as winter deepened and their own prey grew scarce, the wolves began closing in. Samuel saw their tracks in the snow just 50 yards from the sycamore, then 30 yards, then 10. One night, he woke to the sound of claws scraping against the bark of the tree. He lay frozen in the darkness, not breathing, as something large moved around the base of the hollow. The scraping continued, a wolf trying to climb, trying to reach the meat hanging in the upper cavity. The fire had burned low, and the scent of cured venison must have been driving the animal mad with hunger. John was already awake, his rifle across his knees. "Do not shoot," Samuel whispered. "We cannot spare the powder." The scraping stopped. They heard a huff of breath, then the soft crunch of paws moving away through the snow. Neither brother slept again that night. Spring came slowly, grudgingly, as though the mountains resented releasing their grip on the land. The snow melted in stages, revealing mud and deadfall and the half-frozen carcasses of animals that had not survived the winter. The river swelled with runoff, turning brown and angry, flooding the lower banks until Turkey Run became a torrent. The Pringle brothers emerged from their hollow like men returning from the dead. Samuel could barely recognize his own hands. The skin was loose over the bones, the fingernails cracked and yellowed. He had survived. They both had. But the cost was written on their bodies, on their faces, in the hollowed-out eyes that stared back from the river's reflection. "First winter," John said. His voice was hoarse from months of disuse. "Hardest one is done." "2 more charges of powder," Samuel replied. "We used 3 over the winter, 3 more, and we have nothing." John nodded slowly. The mathematics had not changed. Survival required ammunition. Ammunition required resupply. Resupply meant returning to the settlements. "We still have time," John said. "Summer for hunting, fall for preparation. Maybe we can stretch what we have through another year. And then we decide." The second winter was easier. They knew what to expect. They knew how much meat to store, how to bank the fire, how to manage the cold and the hunger and the endless grinding isolation. The wolves came again, But the brothers had reinforced the base of the tree with deadfall and thorns, creating a barrier that discouraged climbing. Samuel shot a bison in the early fall, a young bull that had wandered too close to the river. The meat lasted until February. They did not starve. They did not freeze. They did not speak of the future. The third year began like the others: spring hunting, summer preparation, fall frenzy. But the powder horn was nearly empty now. Every shot required calculation. Every miss was a catastrophe. In September, Samuel counted what remained: 4 charges, 4 shots to last the entire winter. He told John. John did not respond for a long time. "It is not enough," Samuel said. "We both know it is not enough." "No." "Then what do we do?" John looked east toward the mountains they had crossed 3 years earlier, toward the settlements, toward the world they had fled. "One of us goes back, buys powder and lead, returns before the snow." "Returns how? The journey takes months. And what if I'm captured?" John's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Then you are no worse off than you were before. You still have 4 shots. You still have the tree. Maybe you make it. Maybe you do not. You cannot. I can. I am older. I know the way. And if anyone is going to take the risk, it should be me." Samuel wanted to argue. He wanted to grab his brother and shake him and demand another solution. But there was no other solution. The numbers were the numbers. Without ammunition, they would starve. Starvation was certain death. The journey was only probable death. "When?" Samuel asked. "Tomorrow." John left at dawn, walking east toward the rising sun. Samuel watched until his brother's figure disappeared into the trees. Then he turned back to the hollow sycamore, alone, with 4 charges of powder and an entire winter stretching out before him. The first month was the hardest. Not because of the cold, the weather was mild for October, but because of the silence. Samuel had not realized how much he depended on the sound of another human voice until it was gone. He talked to himself sometimes just to hear words in the air. He talked to the tree. He talked to the wolves that circled in the night, told them to come back later, told them he was not ready to die yet. He shot a deer in early November, spent one of his precious charges on a doe that stood too close to the riverbank. The meat would last perhaps 3 weeks if he was careful, if he was very, very careful. December brought the real cold. Samuel huddled in the hollow, feeding the fire, rationing his meat in portions so small they barely counted as meals. He set snares and caught nothing. He tried to fish through the ice and caught nothing. The world outside the tree had become a frozen wasteland, silent and white and absolutely still. 3 charges of powder remained. Then 2. He shot a rabbit in January, the smallest possible expenditure for the smallest possible return. The rabbit provided meat for 2 days. 1 charge left. The wolves came back. Samuel could hear them every night now, circling, pacing, scraping against the thorns he had piled around the base. They knew he was weak. They could smell it. They were waiting. He pressed his back against the warm interior of the sycamore and closed his eyes. 1 shot. 1 bullet between himself and the dark. If John did not come back, but that was not a thought he could finish. Instead, he thought about the tree, about how it had saved them when Simpson said nothing could, about how the hollow had become home, the only home he had known for 3 years, about how strange it was that a rotting sycamore could keep a man alive when all the cabins and farms and settlements of civilization could not. The fire crackled. The wind howled. The wolves circled. Samuel Pringle waited. February brought the killing cold. Samuel had survived 3 winters in the hollow sycamore, but he had never faced one alone. The solitude was its own kind of predator, gnawing at his mind the way hunger gnawed at his stomach. He found himself talking to the walls of the tree, to the strips of dried meat hanging above him, to the fire that was his only companion in the endless darkness. He talked to John, too. Conversations with a brother who might already be dead. "The powder is almost gone," he said to the empty air one night. 1 charge, 1 shot. If a bear comes out of hibernation early, if the wolves find a way through the thorns. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling upward through the hollow. You should have let me go instead. You are older. You know more. The settlement needs you to survive, not me. But John was not there to argue, and Samuel's words dissolved into the smoke. The tree held. That was the one constant, the one thing Samuel could depend on when everything else had failed. The walls were warm against his back. The cavity trapped the heat of the banked coals and released it slowly through the night. Outside, the temperature plunged so low that the sap in living trees cracked like gunshots. But inside the sycamore, Samuel survived. He rationed his food until there was almost nothing left to ration. A strip of dried venison the size of his thumb once a day. Bark soup when even that was gone. He grew so weak that climbing out of the hollow to gather firewood left him gasping and dizzy, spots dancing before his eyes. The wolves sensed his weakness. They no longer bothered to hide. Samuel saw them in daylight now, bold shadows moving between the trees along Turkey Run. A pack of 7, maybe 8. They had survived the winter on deer and elk, but the deer and elk were scarce, and the wolves were hungry. The scent of cured meat drifting from the sycamore was driving them mad. One afternoon, in late February, Samuel emerged from the hollow to find a wolf standing 10 feet away. It was a large male, gray and black, with yellow eyes that held no fear. It watched Samuel climb out of the tree, watched him gather an armful of dead wood, watched him turn back toward the entrance. It did not move. It did not blink. Samuel's rifle was inside the hollow. 1 charge of powder, 1 shot. If he used it now, he would have nothing left for the rest of the winter. Nothing for the spring, when the real hunting needed to begin. Nothing between himself and starvation. He backed toward the tree, moving slowly, keeping his eyes on the wolf. The animal's ears flattened, its lips pulled back, revealing teeth yellowed with age and use. "Not yet," Samuel said. His voice came out as a croak. "I am not ready to die yet." The wolf held its ground for a long moment. Then, as if deciding Samuel was not worth the effort, it turned and trotted back toward the pack. Samuel did not leave the hollow again for 3 days. The crisis came on a night when the moon was full, and the cold was so intense that Samuel's breath froze in his beard. He was half asleep, drifting in the strange twilight between consciousness and dreaming when he heard the sound. A low growl rumbling up from the base of the tree, then another, then a chorus of them, overlapping, building, until the night seemed filled with nothing but the sound of wolves. Samuel's eyes snapped open. The fire had burned low. In the dim orange light, he could see shadows moving outside the entrance to the hollow. The wolves had found a gap in the thorn barrier. They were inside the perimeter. He grabbed his rifle, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. 1 shot, 1 charge of powder. 7 wolves. The first one appeared in the entrance, its yellow eyes reflecting the firelight. Behind it, Samuel could see others crowding close, jostling for position. They were no longer afraid. They were no longer patient. The winter had starved them as surely as it had starved him, and they had decided that the meat in the tree was worth the risk. Samuel raised the rifle. The wolf in the entrance bared its teeth and crouched, muscles bunching for the leap. If he fired, he would kill one. The others would tear him apart. If he did not fire, they would tear him apart anyway. He thought of John, somewhere out in the darkness, walking toward the settlements or lying frozen in a snowbank. He thought of the 3 years they had survived in this tree, the winters they had endured, the skeptics they had proven wrong. He thought of Simpson's voice. "You'll be dead before January." It was February. He was still alive. The wolf leaped. Samuel did not fire. Instead, he grabbed a burning branch from the fire pit and swung it in a wide arc, spraying sparks and embers into the entrance of the hollow. The wolf twisted in midair, yelping as coals struck its face. It crashed into the wall of the cavity and scrambled backwards, snarling. Samuel advanced, the burning branch held before him like a sword. "Get out! Get out!" He thrust the fire toward the entrance, toward the yellow eyes clustering there. The wolves retreated, snarling, snapping at the flames. Samuel followed them out of the hollow, out into the moonlit night, waving the branch and screaming words that were not words, just sounds, raw and animal and desperate. The pack broke. The wolves scattered into the trees, their shapes dissolving into shadow. Samuel stood in the snow, barefoot, the cold already biting into his feet, the burning branch guttering in his hand. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He was shaking. He was laughing. He was crying. One shot. He still had one shot. He stumbled back to the hollow, rebuilt the fire, and did not sleep until dawn. March came like a reprieve from a death sentence. The snow began to melt. The ice on the river broke apart and flowed downstream in great grinding sheets. The wolves, their bellies finally full of winter-weakened deer, stopped circling the sycamore and vanished into the forest. Samuel emerged from the hollow and stood in the spring sunlight, feeling its warmth on his face for the first time in months. He was alive. He did not know how. He did not know why. But he was alive. He had one charge of powder, a knife, and nothing else. The fishing lines went back into the river. The snares went back into the underbrush. Samuel ate trout and rabbit and the first green shoots of spring, and slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild his strength. The tree had kept him alive through the winter. Now the land would have to keep him alive until John returned. If John returned. The weeks passed. April became May. The forest exploded into green, birds returned to the valley, and still Samuel was alone. He stopped counting the days. He stopped looking toward the east every morning. He stopped hoping. And then, on a morning in late May, he heard footsteps in the underbrush. Samuel's hand went to his rifle. One shot. If this was a stranger, an enemy, a soldier come to arrest him at last, a figure emerged from the trees, thin, bearded, walking with the careful pace of a man who had traveled a very long way. John Pringle stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared at his brother. "You are alive," he said. Samuel could not speak. He could not move. He could only stand there, in front of the hollow sycamore, while tears ran down his face and his brother walked toward him. They embraced in silence, two men who had survived the impossible, holding each other in the spring sunshine while the river ran past and the birds sang in the trees. "I brought powder," John said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Lead, salt, everything we need." Samuel pulled back and looked at his brother's face. There was something there, something beyond exhaustion and relief, a light in his eyes that had not been there before. "What is it?" Samuel asked. "What happened?" John took a breath. "The war is over, has been over for years. The Treaty of Paris, they signed it in 1763. We did not know. All this time, the French and Indian War has been done." Samuel stared at him. "But the desertion—" "4 years have passed since we left Fort Pitt. 5, almost. The Army has bigger problems than 2 men who vanished half a decade ago. I walked into the settlements on the South Branch, and no one arrested me. No one even looked twice." John's voice cracked. "Samuel, we can go home." Home. The word hung in the air between them, strange and unfamiliar. For 3 years, home had been an 11-foot hollow inside a dying sycamore. Home had been the sound of wolves circling in the dark and the smell of wood smoke and cured meat. Home had been isolation so complete that Samuel had forgotten what it felt like to hear another human voice. "The settlements," Samuel said slowly. "We can go back to the settlements. We can go anywhere. The proclamation of '63 still stands, technically, but no one enforces it out here. The treaties are changing. Land is opening up." John turned to look at the hollow sycamore, its white bark gleaming in the morning light. "We survived this, brother. We survived what Simpson said was impossible. And now we can tell people what we found." Samuel followed his brother's gaze to the tree that had saved their lives, the tree that no one would believe had sheltered 2 men through 3 Allegheny winters, the tree that had proven every skeptic wrong. What do we tell them? John smiled. Everything. The brothers left the Buckhannon Valley in the summer of 1767, walking east toward the settlements they had fled 6 years earlier. They did not walk in fear. For the first time since the night they deserted Fort Pitt, they moved through the world like free men. No one hunted them. No one wanted them dead. The war that had driven them into the wilderness was over, and the wilderness had changed them into something new. The journey took weeks, but it felt shorter than Samuel remembered. The mountains that had once seemed insurmountable now felt familiar, almost welcoming. The trails that had been invisible were clear to him now, readable like words on a page. He had learned the language of this country. He had earned the right to speak it. They reached the south branch of the Potomac in early fall, walking into a settlement that had grown and changed since they last saw it. New cabins dotted the hillsides. New faces filled the trading post. But some faces were the same. Charity Cutright recognized Samuel before he recognized her. She was standing outside her father's cabin, carrying a pail of water from the spring, when she saw the two men approaching from the west. She set the pail down slowly, her eyes widening. Samuel Pringle? He stopped. The voice reached something inside him that he had forgotten existed. Charity had been a girl when he left, barely 17. Now she was a woman, and she was looking at him with an expression he could not quite read. "Miss Cutright," he said. His voice felt rusty, unused to polite conversation. "I have been away. 6 years." She did not smile. "We heard you were dead." "We were not dead. We were—" He paused, uncertain how to explain. "How did you tell someone that you had lived inside a tree, that you had eaten bark and fought wolves and survived 3 winters in a hollow carved by rot?" It sounded like madness. It probably was madness. "You were where?" Charity asked. Samuel took a breath. "West, past the mountains, in a valley no one has mapped." Now she smiled. It was a cautious smile, uncertain, but it was real. "You will have to tell me about it." "I will tell everyone," Samuel said. "If they want to hear." They wanted to hear. The story spread through the South Branch settlements like wildfire in dry grass. 2 deserters, hunted men, surviving 3 years in unmapped wilderness, living inside a hollow sycamore tree, eating bison and elk and trout from streams that had never seen a fishing line. A valley so rich with game that a man could feed himself without clearing a single acre. The settlers listened. The farmers leaned in. The traders asked questions that grew more specific with each telling. How large was the hollow? Big enough to turn an 8-foot fence rail inside. How did you keep warm? The walls were 3 feet thick. Build a fire pit at the base. Let the heat rise. Warmer than any cabin I have ever slept in. And no one else lives there. No Indians, no other settlers. No one. Empty land, waiting to be claimed. John Simpson heard the story third hand, from a trader who had heard it from a farmer who had been drinking at the same tavern as the Pringle brothers. Simpson did not believe it at first. He had told those boys they would die. He had told them no man could survive an Allegheny winter without a cabin, without a community, without supplies. But the Pringle brothers were standing in the trading post, very much alive, and they were describing a valley that Simpson himself had never explored. He found John Pringle behind the general store, repairing a saddle. "I heard your story," Simpson said. John looked up. His face showed no surprise, no resentment, only the calm confidence of a man who had been proven right. "You said we would be dead before January," John replied. "I did. It is now September. We have survived 3 Januaries since then." Simpson was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a debt. "The tree shelter. It actually worked?" "Better than any cabin. The Sycamore did half the work for us. Insulation, chimney, storage. Nature built it all. We just moved in." "And the valley, this Buckhannon country, it is as rich as you say?" "Richer. Bison in the meadows. Deer so thick you could walk among them. turkeys along every stream, fish that jump onto your line. John set down the saddle and met Simpson's eyes. You were wrong about the tree, but you were right about one thing. No man can survive out there alone forever. That is why we came back. To recruit settlers? To lead them. Anyone who wants good land, fertile soil, and game enough to last a lifetime, we know the way. Simpson studied the man in front of him. The John Pringle who had left the Cheat River 3 years earlier had been desperate, half-starved, running from the law. The John Pringle who stood here now was something else entirely. He had the look of a man who had been tested and had not broken. I will spread the word, Simpson said finally. There are families here who would give anything for what you describe. John nodded. Tell them to be ready. We leave in the spring. The expedition departed in the spring of 1769. Samuel Pringle led the way, with Charity, now his wife, walking beside him. Behind them came her brother John Cutright and his family, then Thomas Hughes, then John and Elizabeth Jackson with their sons George and Edward, the Hacker family, the Sleeths, the Radcliffes, John Brown and his wife. A dozen families, 30 or 40 people, all following two men who had once been wanted criminals into land that was still technically forbidden. They did not care about the proclamation line. They did not care about royal decrees or Indian treaties or the disapproval of colonial governors. They cared about land. They cared about opportunity. They cared about building something new in a place where no one could tell them how to live. The journey took 3 weeks. Samuel led them up the Tygart Valley, past the horseshoe bend where they had parted from Simpson, past the forks and tributaries he had memorized during 6 years of survival. When they crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley of the Buckhannon River, the settlers fell silent. The land stretched out before them like a promise. Green meadows, dark forests, the silver ribbon of the river winding north. Game was visible even from this distance, a herd of deer grazing in the bottomland, turkeys moving through the underbrush. The air smelled of pine and wildflowers and possibility. There, Samuel said, pointing downstream. Turkey Run. That is where we lived. They descended into the valley, and Samuel showed them the sycamore. The tree still stood, its white bark weathered but intact. The hollow that had sheltered 2 men through 3 winters now gaped empty, but the fire pit was still visible, the smoke stains still dark against the interior walls. The settlers crowded around, peering inside, measuring the cavity with their eyes. "You lived in this?" Elizabeth Jackson asked. Her voice held equal parts wonder and disbelief. "We survived in this," Samuel replied. "Cabin walls are 6 inches thick. These walls are 3 feet. It was warmer than any structure I have built with my own hands." George Jackson, Elizabeth's elder son, ran his hand along the interior. He was 17 years old, sharp-eyed and ambitious, already calculating what this land might become. "A man could build anything here," he said. "The timber alone is worth a fortune." "Build, then," John Pringle said. "That is why we brought you." They built. Within a year, cabins lined the banks of the Buckhannon. Fields were cleared, crops were planted, livestock grazed in the meadows where bison had once roamed. Bush's fort rose at the confluence of the river and Turkey Run, a fortified structure where the settlers could gather in times of danger, a physical declaration that this valley was no longer wilderness. The Pringles settled on Cutright Run, near the sycamore that had saved their lives. Samuel and Charity built a cabin, raised children, planted orchards that would bear fruit for generations. The tree stood as a silent witness to their prosperity, a reminder of what desperation and ingenuity could accomplish. Samuel never forgot the lessons of those years. He taught his sons to read the land the way he had learned to read it, not as something to be conquered, but as something to be understood. He taught them that survival came from adaptation, not domination. He taught them that sometimes the rejected solution was the only solution that worked. When the Revolutionary War came, Samuel Pringle served as captain in the Virginia militia. The same military system that had once wanted him dead now trusted him to lead men in battle. The irony was not lost on him. He had deserted the British Army because it treated him like chattel. Now he fought against that army to ensure no American would be treated that way again. John Pringle never returned to the Buckhannon Valley. After leading the settlers to their new home, he continued west, drawn by the same restlessness that had driven him out of Fort Pitt. He made his home in Kentucky eventually, another frontier, another wilderness to tame. The brothers had survived together, but they were not meant to settle together. Their paths had diverged the moment they no longer needed each other to stay alive. The settlement on the Buckhannon grew into a community. The community became a county. Harrison County was carved from the Virginia wilderness in 1784, and George Jackson, that sharp-eyed 17-year-old who had measured the sycamore with his eyes, held the first session of court at his home near the river. George's son Edward married, had children, and built a mill on a stream a few miles south of the original settlement. The place became known as Jackson's Mill. Edward's grandson was born there in 1824, a boy named Thomas, who would later acquire a nickname at the Battle of Bull Run, Stonewall Jackson, the great Confederate general. His great-grandfather had been among the first settlers to follow two deserters into a valley that no one believed could sustain life. The tree died eventually, as all trees do. Disease or age or simple exhaustion claimed it, and the hollow that had sheltered the Pringle brothers collapsed into rot. But a seed had fallen. A new sycamore grew in its place, reaching toward the same sky, drinking from the same stream. That tree died too, and another grew. The sycamore standing at Pringle Tree Park today is the third generation, or so the locals claim. It rises beside Turkey Run, its white bark mottled with the same patterns that Samuel Pringle saw on winter mornings 250 years ago. The hollow is still there, not as large as the original, but large enough to climb inside, large enough to imagine what it might have been like. A highway marker on Route 119 tells the story in brief, clipped sentences. Two brothers, a hollow tree, 3 years, the founding of a settlement. Visitors stop, read the sign, take photographs. Some of them walk down to the tree and peer inside the cavity. They try to picture two men huddled around a fire, wolves circling in the darkness, powder running low, winter closing in. Most of them cannot picture it. The world has changed too much. We have forgotten what it means to survive with nothing, to gamble everything on an idea that every expert dismisses, to prove the skeptics wrong through sheer stubborn refusal to die. But the tree remembers. Samuel Pringle lies buried in the Philadelphia Cemetery in Hampton, Upshur County, not far from the land where he raised his family and lived out his days. The headstone is weathered now, the inscription difficult to read. He was born in 1728 in Philadelphia. He died around 1803, or perhaps as late as 1830. The records are unclear, as frontier records often are. He lived somewhere between 75 and 102 years, depending on which account you believe. It does not matter. What matters is that he lived at all. He should have died a dozen times. In the cramped barracks of Fort Pitt, where the flux killed stronger men. On the banks of Looney's Creek, where his companions were captured. In the hollow of the sycamore, where wolves scratched at the bark and the cold pressed in like a living thing. He should have died, and he did not die because he found a solution that no one else would have tried. John Simpson said it was impossible. The mathematics said it was impossible. The entire weight of frontier experience and conventional wisdom said that two men could not survive an Allegheny winter without a cabin, without a community, without a supply line. The mathematics were wrong. The sycamore stands today at the edge of Turkey Run, its roots drinking from the same water that Samuel Pringle fished 2.5 centuries ago. The hollow is smaller than it was, or perhaps it only seems smaller now that we are used to larger spaces. But it is still there, still waiting, still offering shelter to anyone desperate enough to need it. The wolves are gone. The bison are gone. The elk that grazed in the upland meadows have not been seen in 200 years. But the tree remains, and the river remains, and the story remains. Two brothers walked into the wilderness with nothing but their rifles and their lives to lose. They found a dying tree and made it into a home. They survived what could not be survived, built what could not be built, proved what could not be proven. The rejected solution became the only solution that worked, And somewhere in the hollow of that ancient sycamore, if you press your ear against the bark on a cold winter night, you can almost hear the echo of a fire crackling, and two voices talking softly, and the sound of wolves circling in the dark, waiting for men who refuse to die.